Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Rambling Kings podcast, hosted by me, Embrace Historia, the show where it's okay to shout, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" Or, "A horse, my kingdom for a horse." Now, this is the first ever podcast I've done, so if it's rusty and a bit all over the place, please forgive me. I'm still working on how to do a podcast. Now let me explain what the Rambling Kings podcast is about. It's me and sometimes a guest ranting about a particular king. However, as it's the first episode, I wanted to go big, and instead of talking about one king, let's talk about 3 kings in Britain. Now the topic of discussion will be about things that won't be going into the Medieval King series. But 4 things I want to focus on when talking about these kings are what I think of them, how I first came across them in my research or in general, and what I think the public perception of them is. And the final one is their future use in culture as well as the spirit of the times, as in more recent years, more kings are coming into the public consciousness, whether that's through drama shows or video games or historical movies, plays, etc. There's many different ways kings can appear in culture, but you may be asking, why kings? Well, the short answer is, I've always been interested in kingship, especially medieval kingship, from a young lad to my now 30-year-old self, from the coronation of Edgar the Peaceful of England to the Davidian Revolution under King David of Scotland and the Welsh Parliament under Owen Glendower, plus many more. I find it fascinating how the role of kingship has changed along with each state. Now that's just to give a small reason for my passion for kingship. Also, it helped that my grandfather took me to many castles over the years. As for the order of the kings, I'm probably not going to go in chronological order, as there's many kings in Britain to talk about. For example, one king I've been itching to talk about for years now is King Stephen of England. So he might be the focus of the next episode, and going back to the culture of kingship in TV, one of the biggest shows on at the moment is House of the Dragon, which is based off the civil war that King Stephen started, the anarchy. So I would really like to discuss him. Anyway, back to the topic of today, the 3 kings I'll be discussing are all from the same time period of the 9th century in Britain, which you should know is the age of the Vikings' attacks and settlements into Britain. The first one is obviously going to be Alfred the Great. Not a huge surprise, he is one of my favourite kings. The next one is Donald II of Alba. He is considered the first king of Alba, a change from King of the Picts. Unfortunately, Donald is the king without much information. We're quite fortunate that a good amount of information we have on Alfred comes from the Welsh monk Asser's account of Alfred, and of course the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. But our final king is King Rhodri, King of the Britons. Now these men all have something in common with each other. They all defeated a good amount of Vikings, but also lost a few times to them. So they're on peg with, in terms of the level playing field of who beat the Vikings the most. I would say they're pretty even. I mean, probably Alfred is the most famous one because of the Battle of Edington, but then Rhodri also won quite a number of battles against them as well, and so did Donald. Now, the reason I chose these 3 rulers are, 1, they are important to the history of their respective nations. They're early Middle Ages kings, which means there's not as much information on them as I would like to be. And thirdly, because they all existed around the same time period. Now, before we go into the first part, which is my opinion, I just want to give a little bit of information about myself, because I don't really, give too much information about myself. First of all, I'm not a historian. I didn't study history past GCSEs, which, if you're not from the UK, is basic high school. I did want to study them at A-level, but I chose other subjects, much to my regret. But I've always had a passion for history, and it's my biggest regret not studying history into further education. So I suppose my YouTube channel is a way of making amends for that. What I did study was English literature at university, so I would describe myself as an idiot who likes to read. Someone else who liked to read was King Alfred. According to Asser, Alfred yearned for knowledge and education. But when it comes to the public perception of Alfred, I don't think the public really knows that much about Alfred. He's most famous for defeating the Vikings and coming up with the idea of England, which I'm just going to say now because I get quite a few comments on the Medieval Kings series about the fact I start with King Alfred. He's the guy who got the ball rolling on creating England, and he's one of the few kings with great in his name. It would be foolish not to start with Alfred, and frankly, again, he's one of my favourite kings. And the good thing is about Alfred is, compared to earlier Middle Ages kings, there's actually more information about Alfred. We've got the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, we've got Asser's account of him, we've even still got charters from Alfred's reign. So it's really important we start with him. I know he's not the first king of England, but he's the guy who gets the ball rolling. And I will keep saying that until I probably stop getting comments about it. However, probably actually comment about it, rage harder, because obviously comments are good for YouTube videos and podcasts, so carry on. Anyway, moving on to the public perception of King Alfred. When I think of King Alfred in the public's perception, I do wonder how much the average, say, British person would think about King Alfred, and I don't think that's a lot, really, unless you're from, say, Winchester, because obviously in Winchester you've got a lot of stuff dedicated to Alfred. Like there's a big, lovely, huge statue of him right in the centre of Winchester, which I've been to quite a few times because I do like Winchester a lot. It's a very nice city, lovely cathedral as well, which if you want to learn more about King Alfred, when I went there, they had this beautiful display set up of all of Anglo-Saxon Winchester. So some of the earliest history of it from parts from Hyde Abbey, which is where originally Alfred and King Edward the Elder were buried. But I think a lot of the public perception would come from TV shows, and Alfred has been in at least a few TV shows in the last few years. So there was the Vikings one, which honestly I didn't really enjoy myself, but the one I did really enjoy was The Last Kingdom, which came out a few years ago. They're based on books, novels about a Saxon chap who gets kidnapped by Norse and becomes like this weird sort of, he's Saxon but he's raised Norse, so he worships like the old gods, whereas in the show, in the first season, I think Alfred wins the Battle of Edington and Guthrum converts to Christianity, that sort of thing. But other than TV shows, there is actually quite a few video games that feature Alfred. So one thing I started to do before this podcast, because this is going to be shown on YouTube first, there'll be like little clips of different things that show the kings that we're talking about. So one video game Alfred features prominently in is Total War Thrones of Britannia, which takes place shortly after the Battle of Edington. And if you play as the faction of Wessex, which is probably one of the best factions to play as if you're new to the game. If you want a challenge, you could play as someone else. But that game, the faction leader is Alfred the Great, and you actually control him as a leader, a commander, so he can actually die in battle, which would be terrible. But the game tend to focus on sort of conquering basically the thrones around Britannia. So you've also got Ireland featured there, you've got what is soon to be Scotland in the north, but then you've also got Vikings coming in and raiding. So it tries to create a sort of historical atmosphere of what Alfred's reign was like. I really enjoyed that game. I know when it first came out, a lot of people did enjoy it, but any game that features early Middle Ages kings fighting and all that, I'm into it, you know. The other game that Alfred does appear in recently that I bought was Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Now, when I bought this recently, and I forgot how big the Assassin's Creed games were. When I bought it, it was £12 because it was on offer. But when I installed it, it was 168 gigs. So I did try and get some clips showing Alfred in the video game. But the problem is the game is so big, I just haven't had the time to actually fully immerse myself in playing it. So one section they have in that game is a historical feature where you can explore the settlements which have been recreated from with help from archaeologists and academic historians. So it tries to portray it as accurate as you can, which is lovely for educational content, which obviously I make. So I may be using Assassin's Creed Valhalla when I'm talking about early Middle Ages Britain, for example. But he appears in it. Alfred is a prominent main character. And what I really did like about it, from what I saw, is that Alfred, his ailment is hidden. So if you don't know, Alfred suffered, we think Alfred suffered from an inflammatory bowel condition. Whether that's Crohn's or something else, we don't know, but it was incredibly painful according to Asa. And in the video game, I think when I was reading the Wikipedia article on Alfred in the video game, because like I said, I haven't had time to really immerse myself in it, it showed him sort of weak, but he sort of hid that with like heavy clothes, I think it said. So I thought that was quite interesting, because one criticism I have in some of the video games is not the video games, sorry, the TV shows, they don't show Alfred in pain. Like the way Asa describes it, it sounds like Alfred was always in pain, agonizingly in pain. So it would be nice to see in TV shows like one section say Alfred's in a scene and he's talking, and then immediately stops talking because he's in such pain that he can't continue talking. That sort of realism in a TV show would be lovely to see. Moving back to video games, the next video game that Alfred appears in is one you might be familiar with, Crusader Kings. Now, this is a game where you basically take control of a character from a certain time period during the Middle Ages, from anywhere from England all the way to North Africa and the Middle East. And Alfred appears in this as a Earl, Alfred of Dorset. So it's the starting date that you can play from where Alfred appears in is during the great heathen army that's invading what is soon to be England. And obviously your brother is the liege, your king, but he obviously dies after a battle and then you become king. But what's interesting about Crusader Kings, there's three games of it. I don't know if Alfred appears in the first one because I've never played the first one. I've only ever played 2 and 3. But in the second one, where the game starts, you'll see on the screenshot, if you're watching this on YouTube, you see the Great Heathen Army coming in, and they've landed in what is Northumbria, and they're coming in and they're invading. You will play as Alfred, or you can play as his brother and try and sire an heir, but Alfred will be your heir. So the way the game works for Crusader Kings is your family members, you have to reproduce, you have to have an heir, otherwise the game ends. That's how it works. So Alfred is your heir if you play as his brother. Anyway, you play as Alfred, and one thing the game has is a trait system. And these traits can provide benefits or hindrances. So there's the 7 deadly sins which appear in the game, where, lust, greed, that sort of thing, and they can have negative effects. But then you've also got green traits which are seen as good. And Alfred has a lot of green traits, because obviously he's considered Alfred the Great. He's a very significant historical character. However, what I do like about what both games do, because CK2 and CK3 both have this, the trait system, they have given him the illness trait. So they haven't developed one specifically for like Crohn's disease or a inflammatory bowel disease. They've invented one called illness, where your character is more likely to suffer ailments or even die. So that's one hindrance they give Alfred, because realistically, looking at his trait system, he's actually the perfect character if he didn't have the illness trait. Now, I think you can get rid of the illness trait in CK2. I don't know if you can get rid of it in CK3. I've only recently bought CK3 because it was on offer, and I only tend to buy games when they're on offer. The last game I bought at full price was way back in, 2011? And that was Pokemon Soul Silver, because that's my favorite Pokemon game. Anyway, that's something entirely different. But there is a major difference between the two games. In CK2, Alfred isn't married and doesn't have an heir, whereas in CK3, he starts off married and with his own heir. So the historical realism is there, but then obviously alternate history can take place where, for example, Alfred's brother has an heir, has a male heir, and he becomes king. I'm sure there's a lot more video games I've probably missed, but I just wanted to look at the ones that I've been playing recently that I know Alfred actually appears in as someone you can either play as or a major character. There may be more games, like there may be an obscure 1980s game or 1990s game where Alfred the Great appears in, but I just wanted to focus on the ones that I'm familiar with, and obviously I expect some of you are as well. Now moving on to our final topic in regards to King Alfred is the source material for him. So normally when I'm researching something, I like to get my hands on primary sources, secondary sources, just a lot of books or online accounts that I can read. However, with Alfred, I can recommend one book that basically has every major contemporary source we have on Alfred and his life. And it's a book from 1983 called Alfred the Great, Asser's Life of King Alfred and Other Contemporary Sources. This was published by Penguin Classics in 1983. Now, this book is fantastic for everything to do with King Alfred. So obviously the first part is Asser's Life of King Alfred, which doesn't go over all of King Alfred's life. It ends towards the end, but it doesn't cover his death, sadly, so we don't actually know what Asser wrote about King Alfred's death, or if he wrote anything at all. It also includes some lovely maps of Vikings in England, Vikings on the continent, and then it has the Kings of Wessex, as well as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles that mentions Alfred in those texts. So it doesn't have the full Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. It has all of the amounts where Alfred appears in those accounts. But then there's also extracts from the Laws of King Alfred, the treaty between Alfred and Guthrum, the leader of the Vikings after the Battle of Edington, and one of the most important documents is Alfred's will, which is also in the book. There's also some stuff about Alfred and the Cakes, as well as the Alfred Jewel, which is a Anglo-Saxon jewel that's associated with King Alfred. So this book, unfortunately, you can't read it on Internet Archive. There is a 1902 version of Asser's Life of King Alfred on Internet Archive that you can read. But this one, I would say, is the most important book to get if you want to research King Alfred, because it contains literally every contemporary source going for about King Alfred. So it's really, really important to get if you want to research it. You can buy it online. I have seen copies of it for quite a cheap amount. I mean, I think I bought this a few years ago for like maybe £5, so that would be about $8. But you can also get a internet version of it, which you can read online for about, I think, £3, an ebook version of it for £3. Of course, with my eyes being not the greatest, I don't really want to stare at a screen for too long, so I prefer books over reading online. But to give you a small extract of Asser's Life of King Alfred, I'll just read the introduction. To my esteemed and most holy lord, Alfred, ruler of all the Christians on the island of Britain, King of the Angles and Saxons, Asser, lowest of all the servants of God, wishes thousandfold prosperity in this life and in the next, according to the desires of his prayers. So that's the opening to Asser's account of King Alfred. And then it goes on to explain his birth, where he was born, stuff like that. So, yeah, it's a really important account. And if you do want to research King Alfred, I would highly recommend just this one book. And obviously, if you want, you can get some secondary sources written by historians. This book is phenomenal, and I would highly recommend it if you want to research King Alfred. Our next king is Donald II of Alba, considered the first king of the emerging kingdom of Alba. So at this point in what is now Scotland, the history gets a bit murky, where certain parts of Scotland are held by the Norse, certain parts of it are held by the kingdom of the Picts, and then obviously you've got the Scottish tribe as well, which eventually mixed with the Picts to form the kingdom of Alba. I've summarised it because the history of that particular kingdom is quite more complex than it sounds, but Donald II is considered the first king of Alba, and that's why I wanted to mention him in this podcast, because he's an important first stepping stone towards the Kingdom of Scotland, and I felt like it was good to include him alongside Alfred, because they're sort of like the starters of their successive kingdoms. So Alfred obviously got the idea of England started. Donald obviously was the first king of Alba. Donald didn't reign quite as long as King Alfred. Donald reigned for about 11 years before dying, which, considering how much Scotland was under attack from Vikings, is rather impressive. In fact, Donald's entire reign is in contrast to the Viking attacks on Scotland, where he was basically just having to deal with them constantly. So an 11-year reign is quite impressive for the time period. As for sources of information for him, there is not a lot, and I mean there's not a lot. Compared to Alfred, there's barely anything. Even though he's the first king of Alba, there's no Welsh monk giving a chronicle of his life or really anything like that. But he is featured in a few chronicles, but they're not really that detailed, unfortunately. As for the public perception of him, I don't think there is one. I think if you went to most people in Scotland today and said, "Oh, do you know who Donald II is of Alba?" they'd be like, "What?" So I really don't think there is much public perception of them. Unless you're really into Scottish history, you're not going to know who Donald is, unfortunately. As for my opinion of him, I think, first King of Alba, big achievement, but the problem is just the lack of information. So you can't really give an in-depth, detailed, personality-based answer because there isn't the information there, unfortunately. The only thing I can say from reading the Annals of Ulster, which is an Irish source, there's this funny tale of this woman, this giant woman coming out of the sea to Scotland. So this is from the Annals of Ulster in the year 891, where it says, "The sea cast up a woman in Scotland whose length was 195 feet, the length of her plait 17 feet, the fingers on her hand 7 feet, and the length of her nose 7 feet. And altogether she was as white as a swan." So I'm assuming Donald had to deal with a 190-foot tall woman at some point in Scotland, which if he got her on his side, she would be a great help in getting rid of the Vikings out of Scotland. As for Donald in TV shows and culture, you'd have to stretch the historical interpretation quite a lot. I mean, you could do a show about the Vikings invading Scotland and settling in Scotland with Donald as one of the characters who obviously dies because he, dies fighting the Vikings. So there would be that sort of story to tell, but I think maybe the public has had a bit too much of Vikings recently and they want something different. As for video games, really, Donald does appear as a listed king in Crusader Kings, but because he's past the time period you can't really play as him unless you play through the campaign and get an heir called Donald. So there's not really anything of an interpretation there. Also in Thrones of Britannia, again, you can play as a kingdom that could have a Donald that would become King of Alba. But again, there's actually no set character in Thrones of Britannia, but there is in Crusader Kings too. And as for information about Donald, realistically, you're only going to find him in the Annals of the Kings of Scotland or the Chronicles of the Kings of Scotland, where it basically says, Donald, Constantine's son, held the kingdom for 11 years. The Northmen wasted Pictland at that time. That's one extract of it. The other chronicles mention a battle between the Vikings, which Donald won, but eventually he was killed by the Vikings in another battle. So that really is just the tale of Donald. There's not a lot of information on him. However, I would give him this. Donald obviously created some sort of security within Scotland because the succession was smooth from what I can tell. His successor was Constantine II, who is, in my opinion, one of Scotland's best kings because he reigned for so long, like over 40 years, and he didn't die in battle. He just retired and went to a monastery. He abdicated and went to a monastery. So he's a really important king. So obviously Donald setting the stage for someone, his cousin, to take the throne and to make Scotland an even greater kingdom or develop it into an even greater kingdom. So I really like Constantine II at some point as well in the future, but he's another great king of Scotland, similar to David the First and Robert the Bruce. Our final great king is a king from Wales, Rhodri the Great, the first major leader who defeated the Vikings in Britain. So Rhodri is called King of the Britons for his achievements, but he was a king of a kingdom in North Wales that basically controlled about just over half of Wales by the time of his reign's end. So a very powerful king who we've covered already on this channel before, but not in the topics we're talking about today. Rhodri is an interesting case because of how he developed his power wasn't through conquering his nearby neighbours, it was actually just inheritance. So he started off with one kingdom, and then he inherited Powys, and then a few other kingdoms through marriage. So by the time of his reign's end, he controlled several kingdoms, and the way it worked in Wales at the time was land was distributed to the sons. It wasn't just one successor. There wasn't the laws of primogeniture there at the moment. It was, if you had a lot of sons, the land you had would be distributed between them, and that is what happened with Rhodri. It was kind of a detriment to Wales in the future because you wanted someone who could control it all, and there was cases where Rhodri's grandson, Hywel, became literally the whole king of Wales apart from the kingdom of Gwent in the south of Wales. So his line does really start to get going in terms of there being a really close king of all Wales till the High Middle Ages. And while Rhodri is a fascinating figure, again, same with Donald, there's just not much on him. I mean, one of my favourite books to read about Wales is a book called The History of Wales by John Davies, and he writes about Rhodri. Unfortunately, the entire evidence relating to the life of Rhodri consists of a few sentences, yet he must have made a deep impression upon the Welsh, for in later centuries, being of the line of Rhodri was a primary qualification for their rulers. It's hard to say the public perception of Rhodri. In Wales, I imagine he's quite popular, especially in the north of Wales, because he sort of fits the Arthur mythos of he defeated a great enemy who was invading Wales at the time, but then tragically lost his life fighting another great enemy. Maybe he'll come back one day. So he sort of fits a bit of the Arthur mythos. He's become a bit more prominent in the culture of the world, really, because of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, because Rhodri appears in that. Now, I haven't played up to that point where Rhodri is in the game, because like I said, I've only just gotten the game, but I've obviously spoiled it for myself by looking at what happens to him. And the ending Rhodri suffers, I'm not particularly happy with, because he dies from a blood eagle. Spoiler alert, sorry. But it just doesn't really make much narrative sense, because Rhodri defeated the Vikings. He may have lost, fled to Ireland, and then come back and then beat them, but he died fighting against the Mercians, who I know their king was a Viking choice. But still, he lost to the Mercians, as the Annals of Ulster record the great victory Rhodri won over the Vikings, as it reads, Horm, chief of the Dark Foreigners, was killed by Rhodri, king of Wales. So a really big omission of the title Rhodri have. He wasn't king of all Wales, but it was a powerful title to bestow on him. So again, prestige and power, which is typical of the Middle Ages. The Annals also record that Rhodri, king of the Britons, was killed by the Saxons. Rhodri doesn't directly appear in Thrones of Britannia, but he is mentioned heavily in one of the campaigns as one of his sons is the leader of his kingdom, and it basically mentions about succeeding where his father did, but then also getting revenge on the Mercians, which does happen in reality, the Battle of Conway, where Rhodri is avenged according to the Welsh Annals. So there is that. Crusader Kings, he does appear as a playable character. You can play as him in CK2 and CK3, with the goal obviously being to unite the whole of Wales and become King of Wales. For the sources of information for Rhodri, you've got obviously the Annals of Ulster, an Irish source, but then you've also got the Welsh Annals, which mention him heavily, but again, there's just not that much on him, so I would recommend potentially looking at secondary sources, because they tend to try and flesh out his story a bit more in regards to the whole nation state of Wales. So again, book I've mentioned before, John Davies' History of Wales, mentions that it was this nationhood that Rhodri promoted alongside Alfred the Great and also Charlemagne, because they both existed around the same time period, the 9th century. In terms of TV shows, Rhodri is a very good character to use in a historical TV show, because he's got the excellent story where he defeats the Vikings at first, then loses to them, flees to Ireland, builds up his forces there, and then heroically comes back to defeat the Vikings, only to then lose his life fighting against the Mercians. So it's sort of a bittersweet story, which I think would be nice to see, but we'll have to wait and see, because I don't have the funds to make a TV show like that. So that was our 3 great kings for the first ever episode of the Rambling Kings podcast. So I hope you all enjoyed that. I'm going to try and at least do one of these a month, because frankly, they're quite easy to make. I haven't got to edit so heavily, which is always the worst. If you ever ask me what's the worst aspect of YouTube, it's the editing. I would love to get an editor one day, but I'm quite a bit of a, not controlling, but I know what I like, and I don't know if I can impart that to somebody who is an editor. But that's an issue for me in the future to deal with. But yes, I hope you all enjoyed the show. If you do want to see more of this, or even behind the scenes of stuff like this, you can always subscribe to the Patreon or YouTube channel membership. There's a lot to see. I do post a lot of pictures from my travels, because I travel quite a bit to historical sites, because obviously I like to film a lot of stock footage, which I obviously use in the videos. So if you're interested in that, please be sure to sub to the Patreon. You can also sub to the Patreon for free as well. You don't have to sign up. So it's just I'm really trying to push the Patreon this year. So I do apologize if it's getting a bit vexing that I'm mentioning it in all my videos, but I'm a YouTuber. It's kind of one thing you have to do, unfortunately. So yeah, I hope you all enjoyed the podcast. I don't know who the next topic's going to be. I need to think about it. I'm thinking King Stephen, but I'm also really feel like talking about Constantine II of Scotland because he's such an interesting figure because of how long he reigned. But I'll figure it out. And again, I'll let you know if you are sub to the Patreon. So hopefully see you all on there. So thank you again for watching or listening as it's a podcast. And yeah, see you later.